want to come to Einar Tangen there in Beijing to give us a sense, Mr. Tangen, that we've got this meeting taking place between India and America bilateral. We've got more bilateral scheduled tomorrow. All of this against the backdrop of the Chinese president not here, the Russian president not here, and the buzz that the world, in a way, in this new world order that is being crafted, there's a sense that an expansionist China remains a concern for a number of countries, particularly in the Western world, who perhaps now see India as a partner in trying to contain an expansionist China. How do you see it from a Chinese viewpoint?
Well, from Beijing's point of view, this is the old colonial way of divide and conquer, set one Asian giant against another. Quite frankly, it's a little disappointing. I mean, I've been listening very carefully. The views have been expressed very well, but everything has been about what's in it for India. You know, the G20, I thought, was supposed to be about how to solve the world's problems, which are quite acute at the moment. You have, you know, the WTO, which is non-functional because the U.S. will not allow the appointment of appellate judges, which would allow a final and binding judgment. The U.S. is standing in the way of a complete climate change wording that would help and somehow address the fact that the developed countries promised $100 billion a year have not delivered. Only 10%, and a large part of that 10% has gone to sweetheart deals for, guess what, the countries involved who are supposedly donating this money. You know, India wants to be the voice of the global South, but it hasn't been able to put in any kind of tough language. It's been stymied, in essence, by the U.S. So there has to be a question of, yes, the U.S. and India seem to be getting closer together, but who is really benefiting? The fact that India will get jet engines, I don't know if that necessarily makes up for the fact that it's dividing India from the rest of Asia. In terms of where China stands, I think the BRICS meeting and the BRICS Plus was fairly successful and shows that there is, in fact, a desire, especially among the global South and also Central Asia, to start trying to come together against the former colonial powers and prevent them from once again, you know, using, grabbing resources at low prices.
But you see, Mr. Tangen, and then I'll come to you, Mr. Sibal, in a moment. You know, we have a word in India, tali do haath se bachti hai. When you clap with both hands. Now, while the Chinese may feel that this is some kind of a ganging up against them, the truth of the matter is, are the Chinese on Ukraine, for example, willing to go along with the growing concern globally that this is a conflict that reflects the manner in which territorial expansionism cannot take place in the 21st century? So, you know, China also has to be seen to be a country that wants to be part of this new world order in a manner that's a rule-based new world order.
Well, that sounds a little bit odd, given that India is benefiting greatly. It's the largest buyer of Russian oil, which is then being refined or just simply shipped to Europe in a circuitous way, and benefiting.
Sure, but that's because it's an I'm sorry to intervene. That's because it's in our national
situation.
No,
so
but
I don't.
But
exactly
that's not the same. That's not the same as. That's not the same as the unwillingness, it appears, of China to see what has happened in Ukraine as an act of aggression.
Well, has India?
Okay, that's a good question. No. Kamal Sibal, you want to respond?
So
you want to respond to what you heard? Mr. Tangen says, look, you're singling out the Chinese. What about the Indians? Are the Indians willing at the G20?
Also, the U.S. The U.S. has doubled its yellow cake order of uranium, while it's telling Europe that they can't buy Russian gas. That seems a little odd. I mean, literally doubling the amount in terms of dollars that they paid. So, I mean, there's a little bit of hypocrisy here.
Is every country, therefore, Kamal Sibal, operating in self-interest? And therefore, at G20, one of the failures, if there is a failure or to evolve a consensus on Ukraine, and that prevents a consensus document communique from emerging, can we only blame the Chinese and the Russians?
No, I don't think so. You know, we've not been able to get a consensus in the UN system itself, whether the UN Security Council or the UN General Assembly, and all the big powers that are present in the United Nations Security Council and are powerful in the UN system are part of the G20 also. So if they couldn't agree in those forums, I can't see them agreeing so easily in this forum. So far as you know, we could not issue a joint statement at the level of the foreign ministers, the finance ministers, the development ministers. Now to expect that at the leadership level, when the President Biden is himself present, he'll agree to a softening of language or will make concessions and then create a storm back home that he has yielded on this issue appears to me to be rather difficult. I don't think we are blaming China for standing in the way of a consensus on language on Ukraine. I think basically...
No, but the U.S. is. But the U.S. is. The U.S. is. And, the fact is, let me take that to Mr. Russo. Mr. Russo, just before the visit, before G20, when asked a question, the U.S. Officials, State Department officials seemed to suggest that it was the Chinese who had to take a call whether they wanted to work together with the rest of the G20. Now you've got, as Mr. Tangen says, don't blame us, don't single us out. Every country here is operating on their self-interest.
Well, we are operating on self-interest, and therefore, it is going to be tough during normal times for the G20 to come to strong, concrete recommendations that would result in action in any of our domestic constituencies once it's over. When we talk about trade matters, we have the WTO. When we talk about development assistance, we have the ADB, the World Bank, and other institutions. The G20 is purpose-built for meaningful action, collective action in times of global crisis. And India, luckily, has had a relatively stable period. There's been some fluctuations of energy, but not as bad as the year before India took over. We haven't had a worsening situation of a new COVID wave that was more devastating or something like that. So we can complain about who may or may not have resulted in the G20 not resulting in concrete outcomes, but frankly, it's more purpose-built for serious action when we're in a deeper crisis than we're seeing right now. So I'm fairly comfortable with the fact that ultimately, if things get watered down somewhat, whether it's conversation about climate change, things like that, there's points to blame on all sides, but also they don't have to react to a substantial crisis. So let's just all be thankful for that.
Mr. Tangen, you're shaking your head vigorously. You want to respond?
Well, I would love to hear the developing countries who are suffering under the dual whammy of massive debts, mostly held by Western nations. Also, the continuous rise in the Fed rate, which is pushing their economies down and making them raise their interest. And the fact that you have civil unrest through swaths of Africa. This idea that there is no global crisis going on, that might work for the U.S., but I don't think that it works for the rest of the world. And I doubt anybody agrees with you. You can say it, but it doesn't make it true.